The first aviators copied design ideas from birds. But where did birds' designs come from? Could time and chance have done it all? Or does the sheer genius in a bird's flight systems suggest a guiding intelligence behind nature? In this pilot episode, we'll admire the technologies in an Albatross and compare the design of another super heavy, the Airbus A380. We'll look at the earliest French plane inspired by the Albatross. We'll see whether planes the size of an Albatross can handle the same extreme winds. And we'll talk to scientists from two sides of the debate. A new atheist?
Unless you're really lazy or extremely sentimental, then you really have to look underneath the apparent design and see whether it could spring from happen chance.
And scientists who see a mind behind nature.
My big question as a mathematician is, can the mechanism that Darwin and others have observed bear the weight that's put upon it?
Some say we're accidents in a universe born by chance. Some say we're children of God. I'm Grenville Kent, a Christian academic, and the new atheists have got me questioning my faith. So I'm going wherever the questions take me with my ever-curious son, Marcus, and talking to leading thinkers on both sides of the God question.
Because I really want the evidence. Is there a God?
And will I ever find a hat that fits? Dreams of human flight were inspired by birds, but the first aviators also got ideas for flight technology from nature. Jean-Marie Lebris, arguably the first aviator, watched Albatross while sailing the Southern Ocean. He then came home to France and built gliders that copied the biomechanics of the Albatross.
Almost 50 years before the Wright brothers, Lebris had very advanced ideas about wings that could change their incidence, their dihedral, and their sweep.
He wanted to copy all the ways a bird's wing can move.
He lacked the technology to make that happen. But then again, we still can't do it, 150 years later. It was here in 1856 that Jean-Marie Lebris, a ship's captain, tested his new invention, le barque à lit, or the winged boat. In a stiff wind, Lebris attached a rope to the back of a cart behind a fast horse. The cart thundered along the beach and suddenly, phoom! How would you feel soaring 100 meters into the winter sky for the first time? The coach driver managed to get himself caught in the tow rope and he shot up 50 meters into the sky, becoming the first aeroplane passenger. Lebris manipulated the wing controls and instinctively moved his body around to keep the little craft stable. And when the tow rope parted, he was able to glide for about 500 meters. The cart driver touched down first, and then Lebris managed to touch down gently onto the beach. He must have been elated. But then, disaster. For his next flight several months later, a crowd gathered, but Lebris didn't use a horse. Instead, he tied his craft above a cliff and simply cut the rope. With no takeoff speed and no wind, the craft stalled and it slammed into the beach. Lebris broke his leg and Le Barque à Lit was destroyed. There followed 12 years of discouragement and financial setback. But then, Lebris came back with a second plane. Lebris, the old sailor, realized that albatrosses rarely flap. They simply adjust their wings. And so he came up with a brilliant design of ropes and pulleys to do just that. And he named the craft l'Albatross artificiel.
The Navy paid for it, but wouldn't let anybody pilot it. And so predictably, it crashed.
These wings can move differently, so like this, to give a propulsion to the machine, or like this to control the flight.
The new aviation is not ready. And the new aviation is with the new material, but also with variable wings, like birds. And we have to study and study like he did himself.
Lebris was a genius. He does not earn money during his life. And at the end of his life, he was completely ruined and considered like a mad.
But tests on the reconstructions show both his gliders would have flown well. Later, the Wright brothers used a similar system of wing warping, a design copied from nature. So, where did nature get those design ideas? If nature is just matter arranged without any thought, why does it have features worth copying? We went to see an award-winning spacecraft designer and engineering professor who's a world leader in flapping micro-air vehicles. He's also publishing research on the engineering features of insects. And Professor Stuart Burgess surprised us.
Engineers have recognised that the natural world contains supreme and supremely optimal design. This is an example of a linkage mechanism that amplifies the motion of the wings. This represents the wing of an insect. This kind of linkage mechanism presents a great challenge to evolution because, as every engineer knows, you cannot evolve step by step a linkage mechanism. All of the links and the pins have to be there simultaneously. And when you look at the fossil record, you can't find examples of intermediates between a simple hinge and a complicated linkage mechanism like that. So I believe this is an example of irreducible complexity, a strong evidence of design.
We went to New Zealand to watch the real albatross. Richard Dawkins says birds developed with no conscious design. A small dinosaur started using its front limbs for lift while chasing flying insects, and they adapted into wings. Skin scales became feathers. 1 billion tiny changes each gave a survival advantage. It's a familiar story, but is it the most likely explanation? We arrive with our questions on what locals call a mild day, only 40-knot winds. Albatross can cruise in 70-knot gales, and so today they're just getting started. With the largest wingspan of any living bird, 3.63 metres, nearly twice my height, albatross make it look so easy. Their flying skill, especially their ability to handle turbulence, it's legendary.
That albatross chick may look like 10 kilograms of fluff, but in a few months he's going to walk to that cliff, take the risk of his life and discover flight. He'll soar effortlessly around the furious 50s and screaming 60s of the great southern ocean. Satellite tracking shows us that albatrosses can do up to 140 kilometres per hour and cover easily 1,800 kilometres in a day. By the time this albatross is 50, it will have done about 6 million kilometres.
Diomedea sanfordi, the northern royal albatross. In low winds, it flaps. But in strong winds, those long, lean sailplane wings will be at full stretch, locked by a special tendon with no muscle effort and almost a resting heart rate.
To soar, to surf the currents of the sky. It's poetry, and it's also amazing science because 98% of its flight energy comes from the elements and only 2% from its own body. Meet the most energy-efficient frequent flyer on the planet.
Professor Mike Tarburton is a passionate ornithologist. We asked him, how can albatross fly in such extreme conditions?
The stronger the wind, the better they fly. They are a very heavy bird. As Richard Dawkins correctly points out, they're at the point where they can't sustain flight for very long by flapping. They need wind because they have to glide to go any distance. That weight gives them stability with that shape of wing. The microcontrols come from these small muscle clusters that are controlled by the medulla, part of the brain. And that works automatically. As different eddies in the wind hit them, that part of the wing makes the correct adjustments, and they stay very stable.
How stable could an aeroplane be in these conditions? We travelled to Kangaroo Island to see how high-performance model planes would go in big winds. Jets have a size advantage, but what about these Albatross-sized planes? Could the best human designs do as well as birds? In just 35-knot winds, the turbulence over the sea edge was brutal. Our experienced gold-wing pilots thought that stable flight might be impossible. But somehow they fought their way into the air. A sea eagle came to investigate. With such an elegant glider, we wondered if it might be love. But it was more aggressive than that. He stalked us all too easily. Thinking of those talons, we took evasive action, and we did get off his cloud, but then...
So why didn't that happen to the Sea Eagle?
They're made of tougher stuff, I think, and they're flexible. These, as you saw, these flex a fair bit, but there is a limit. And obviously the eagles, what I really liked, the eagles tuck their wings back to cope with high winds. We can't do that. The high wind, we just have to try and manage it. I guess, as I said, normally we probably wouldn't fly in this strength wind.
So we gave the pilots a break, but our kite broke a string and nearly decapitated the sound recordist. In these conditions, our pilots decided to use what albatrosses rarely use, powered flight.
This is your Formula One of the air. High speed with a lot of power. We have enough horsepower to drag it out of anything, completely different to the sailplanes we've been flying. I don't know that turbulence is its best friend. It is very stubby, so it'll react very quickly to turbulence. It'll be thrown around a fair bit.
Over to you, Chuck.
Chuck was fast. He nearly gave our cameraman whiplash. But in such heavy conditions, he had to take it easy on the aerobatics. Just a loop here, a half Immelman there. And then on landing approach, he vanished off our radar.
Trashed by turbulence. Even as seabirds were handling it fine. The great news is, though, that Chuck bailed out and managed to survive. The bad news is, though, that I have to explain all of this to the accounts department, and I just might not survive. Unless you do the talking.
We just got in a downdraft. We tried to pick that other wing up that dropped, and then that caused an overreaction, and the plane flipped from one side to the other, lost lift completely, and rolled over. It basically tip-stalled straight into the ground.
Tip-stalled?
Yeah, the wingtip stopped lifting. The wingtip, I can't do that with my hands. The wingtip stopped lifting, and basically the wing falls. If I was to add another 5 channels, how would I do that? How would I control a wing sweeping backwards and shrinking in and going out, and a tail changing shape and size? It took me long enough to learn to use 4 controls.
So it was birds 2, planes 0, in 35-knot winds. In 70-knot winds with Albatross, Chuck wouldn't have made it home. New respect for the Albatross.
This gorgeous little 10-kilogram chick is much more warmly dressed than I am.
And that down will be replaced by strong feathers to hold up a huge bird in the stresses of flight. Feathers grow out those same holes, yet each is different. Wing feathers specialise for lift, tail for control, and so on. With preening oil, they'll withstand Antarctic conditions, years of wear and tear, and then replace themselves. What awesome technology. Professor Andy McIntosh teaches thermodynamics and combustion theory in jet engines. Yet this hardcore aircraft engineer has made a careful study of birds, and he says they reveal design.
A feather is a marvellous example of lightweight aerodynamic engineering. You've got the very important rachis, which is the main stem, which is hollow. From the rachis comes barbs, and from the barbs, there are tiny little hooks on one side, which we call barbules, and on the other side are ridges. So the hooks from one barbule grab the ridges from the adjacent barbule.
But couldn't feathers gradually evolve from scales?
Even if you got a bit of keratin to come out and form a frayed bit of stuff in the wind, it won't be any use as a feather unless you've got the barbules on one side and ridges on the other. That's to do with arrangement, that's to do with information. That strongly suggests design.
Design, design, design. Or a billion lucky accidents tested by trial and error. Nobody doubts an A380 is designed. With 4 million individual components made across 30 countries, nothing here is chance. 6,000 engineers designed the A380, so Airbus has invested literally millions of person-hours of thought to evolve the technology one step forward. And that design builds on older planes, with designers stretching right back to Lebris, who took his ideas from birds.
This wing is a smart wing, and it's very, very flexible. In fact, one hand I can wobble it here. It actually is designed to flex up to 4 meters or 12 feet on takeoff. And its flexibility is part of the way that the plane handles turbulence. But don't worry, there are 8,000 bolts holding the wings onto the central wing box.
It's like the shoulder of a bird, where the stress hits.
An Airbus comes from these huge factories. An Albatross comes from one egg.
Good point. Plus, it does all its own maintenance. We asked the world's most experienced airline if we could have a look at their $500 million toy.
Grenville,
how are you going?
very good. Yourself?
Good, thanks.
G'day, Marcus. Come see the A380. To turn left and right, we have ailerons. We have the big tail fin, and on the end we have the rudders. And to go up and down, we have elevators. We do our best to make small adjustments, but they're nowhere near as quick and as accurate as the flight control computers through the fly-by-wire system.
So you're coming in and a wind gust hits you and knocks you around. What happens next?
Well, it'll sense it and immediately put a control input in, move the control surfaces and pick the wing straight back up.
Are some winds too rough for you to land?
Yeah, they certainly are, mate. We have a 40-knot cross limit on this by design. It's engineered to take more, but we like to keep a nice safety margin in there. It's a very, very smart wing. The first real generation of smart wings was like the F111. They could be straight for slow flight, and then they could sweep them at quite high angles to minimise drag at very high speed flight.
So what's next?
Well, you'd have to ask the structural engineers, but I can tell you where they're looking. They're looking at birds for their input, for their inspiration, because nothing surpasses what a bird can do through any flight regime. The amount they can change their wingspan, their shape of their wing for slow speed, takeoff, for high speed diving, it's unparalleled and unmatched. We don't have the know-how or the materials yet.
So we're still copying birds.
Then there's navigation. Albatross don't have sat-nav, so how do they find their way on a trackless ocean where one wave looks like the next? An albatross parent will fly 2,000 kilometres to find dinner for their chick, then fly home in a straight line.
Most likely, they're using the position of the sun, the moon and the stars. When they're a chick in the nest, seeing the sun and the moon and certain stars imprints an image into that map that they have inherited in their brain, and they remember that for the rest of their life.
An Airbus has 6 big computers. The Albatross has a brain the size of a tablespoon.
If you look right at the end of his nose, you'll see some drips coming off. And the Maori people looked at that and called it Roemata Toroa, the tears of the albatross. And they said it was because he was missing his loved ones so far away across the sea. The bird has a salt gland just near its eye, and it's able to filter out the water it needs and get rid of the concentrated saline, which means it can drink seawater. It's an amazing piece of technology.
A desalination plant the size of a pea. Without that, it would be a case of water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Knowing some of the technologies in an albatross, can I really imagine this complex flying machine forming by mindless, random processes? The probability seems so low, even spread across long time periods. And then aren't there structures that can't evolve gradually? What good is a partly evolved linkage mechanism?
The problems in evolving from a lizard to a bird. Number one, you've got the feather arrangement, which there's no way that could have come about by accident. The feathers are different as well, different positions. So you've got feathers. You've got to be able to oil those feathers, so you need a preening gland. Where's the preening gland going to come from? Lizards don't go around with preening glands. But then, thirdly, you've got to have the ability to get at the preening gland. So you've got to turn your head 180 degrees, bend over backwards to get it, right, thirdly. Then fourthly, you've got to have a different arrangement for energy production, because a lizard is cold-blooded, it has to lay out there, bask in the sun to get its body to the right temperature. A bird is warm-blooded, so the whole energy arrangement and the blood system is totally different. And then probably the worst one of all is that a bird doesn't have a diaphragm and it has a lung which is totally different, both to mammals and to reptiles. We've limited it to 5, but really it's stacks of things which have got to be just right in order to go from a reptile to a bird.
And then there are the plans for all this engineering. Albatross DNA.
An albatross egg is 20 times heavier than a chicken's egg. But please don't even think about a giant omelette. Albatrosses are endangered, and in 79 days a chick will pick its way out. That's why the parents protect their egg with everything they've got. It contains their genes, the recipe for the next generation.
And it's the DNA that really has the scientists talking about the possibility of a mind behind all of this.
The DNA of the albatross contains all the information about the whole bird, all of its systems, all of its morphology, all of its behaviour. It's all there. Something like 20, 30,000 different chemicals are made from the genes. All these genes with all this information. But when we talk about information, where did that information come from? This information speaks of an organiser, a mind, something that put it all together so that it coordinates and works.
To drill into this idea, we went to Oxford University to meet chemistry professor Peter Atkins, a leading new atheist who has authored 70 books.
Don't underestimate the extraordinary power of natural selection in drawing out tiny advantages. Even though DNA is the most complex molecule that we know, there's no reason to suppose that it cannot have been developed by simple chemical processes, amplified and welded into the environment and propagated by evolution and natural selection.
We also met Oxford professor John Lennox, a mathematician with 3 doctoral degrees and a string of publications. He debates new atheists and he challenges the view that DNA occurred by chance.
So it boils down to the claim that unguided natural processes can generate information. And this is where the computer scientists and the information scientists prick up their ears. Because junk in, junk out. There is no evidence whatsoever that unguided natural processes produce information at all. Natural processes can transmit it, but they do not produce it.
Complexity, even awesome complexity, can arise by chance, by seeming chance. And the root of evolution is chance, but a happy accident sometimes leads to greater survivability and greater reproducibility. And so complexity gradually grows. There's nothing mysterious about DNA, and to assert that an intelligence must have lain behind it is simply the musings of a senile philosopher or the meanderings of a lazy mind.
We haven't seen the big transitions. People argue that there's fossil evidence of them, but we haven't actually seen them happen. And when someone like the geneticist, the Harvard geneticist, Richard Lewontin, says, you know, evolution is a fact like the orbiting of the planets round the sun is a fact. And then he goes on to say, non-birds became birds. But just a minute. Apart from the very important question as to what a non-bird might be, nobody's ever seen a non-bird become a bird. And he's making a fundamental confusion between two kinds of science. One we could call empirical laboratory science, and the other we could talk about as historical science. That is, inferring something happened in the past. But he's got no mechanism. So to say that the thing that hasn't been observed is in the same category as the observed is to make a very serious fundamental error.
We leave Oxford with a Lennox question. If you see a car engine working, or a factory where robots make cars without human intervention, would you doubt the existence of Henry Ford?
So what do you think? If we see design in an Airbus, is it scientific to rule out the possibility of design in a biological flying machine of comparable complexity? Could chemicals self-organise into such amazing microtechnologies just by happen chance? Or do you see engineering in nature? If you do, the next logical question might be, who is the engineer? An Albatross doesn't exactly carry a brand name, but wouldn't curiosity make you want to keep looking?